Claustrophobic. Reacher lay among the scuffling rats and heard the sound of the clips being undone, then the squeak of the rubber as a launcher came out of its mounting, then the rattle of the tailgate's bolt ramming home. The footsteps receded, the beams flicked back and toward the doors. The hinges creaked and the bulky timber doors thumped shut. Reacher heard the launcher being laid gently on the shale and the gas as the two men lifted the old log back into the bracket, the rattle of the chain and the click of the padlocks, the crunch of the footsteps crossing the shale. He rolled away from the corpses and hit out at a rat, caught it with an angry backhand and sent it squealing off into the dark. He sat up and waited, walked slowly to the door, listened hard, waited 6 minutes, put his hands into the gap at the bottom of the door and pulled them apart. They wouldn't move more than an inch. He laid his palms flat on the smooth timbers and bunched up his shoulders and heaved. They were rock solid, like trying to push over a tree. He tried for a minute. He was straining like a weightlifter. The doors were jammed. Then he suddenly realized why. They had put the warped old log back in the brackets the other way around, the curved pointing in toward him, not out, away from him, clamping the doors with extra efficiency instead of allowing the foot of loose movements it had allowed before. He pictured the log as he had seen it, more than a foot thick, warped but dried like iron, curved away. It was no Curving away, it was no problem. Curving in, it would be immovable. He glanced at the army trucks, gave it up. There was no space to hit the doors with any kind of momentum. The truck would be pressing on them with all the torque of a big diesel engine, but it wouldn't be enough. He couldn't imagine how much force it would take to shatter that old log. He thought about using a missile, gave it up too. Too noisy, and it wouldn't work anyway. They didn't arm themselves until they were 30 feet in the air, and they only carried 6.5 pounds of explosive, enough to smash a jet engine in flight, but 6.5 pounds of explosive against those old timbers would be like scratching at them with a nail file. He was trapped inside, and Holly was waiting. It was not in his nature to panic. Never had been. He was a calm man, and his long training had made him calmer. He had put he had been taught to assess and evaluate, and to use pure force of will to succeed. You're Jack Reacher. He had been told, you can do anything. First his mother had told him, then his father, then the quiet, deadly men in the training schools, and he had believed them. But at the same time, he hadn't believed them. Part of his mind always said, you've just been lucky, always lucky. And in the quiet times, he would sit and wait for his luck to run out. He sat on the stony ground with his back against the timbers of the door and asked himself, has it run out now? He flicked the flashlight beam around the cavern. The rats were staying away from him. They were interested in the darkness in the back. They deserted me, he thought, deserting the sinking ship. Then his mind clicked in again. No, they're interested in the tunnels, he thought, because tunnels lead places. He remembered the giant mouse holes blasted into the rock face, north wall of the bowl, maybe all interconnected by these narrow seams and back. He ran back into the depth of the cavern, past the trucks, past the grotesque heap of corpses, back to where he could no longer stand. A rat disappeared into the seam on his left. He dropped to his stomach and flicked the flashlight on, crawled after it. He crawled into a skeleton. He scrabbled with his feet and came face to face with a grinning skull, and another. There were 4 or 5 skeletons jammed into the excavated seam, jumbled bones in a pile. He gasped in shock and backed off a foot, looked carefully, used the flashlight close up. All males. He could see that from the 5 pelvises. The skulls showed gunshot wounds, all in the temples. Neat entry wounds, neat exit holes. Jacketed, high-velocity handgun bullets. Fairly recent, certainly within a year. The flesh hadn't decayed, it had been eaten off. He could see the parallel scrape marks on the bones from rodent teeth. The bones were all disturbed. The rats had hauled them away to eat. There were scraps of clothing material here and there. Some of the rib cages were still covered. Rats don't disturb clothing much. Not on the torso. Why should they? They eat their way in through the inside, the soft parts first. They come to the ribs from the back. The clothing material was khaki and olive green, some black and gray camouflage. Reacher saw a colored thread, traced it back to a shoulder flash hidden under a gnawed shoulder blade. It was a curved felt badge embroidered in silk. It said Northwestern Freeman. He pulled at the skeleton's jacket. The rib cage collapsed. The breast pocket had 3 chromium stars punched through. Reacher made a thorough search, lying on his stomach up to his armpits and bones. He pieced together 5 separate uniforms. He found 2 more badges. One said White Christian Identity, the other said Montana Constitutional Militia. He lined up the 5 splintered skulls, checked the teeth. He was looking at 5 men, middle-aged, maybe between 40 and 50, 5 leaders. The leaders who had disappeared, the leaders who could not stand the pace, the leaders who had abandoned their members to Bo Borkin. The roof was too low for Reacher to climb over the bones. He had to push them aside and crawl through them. The rats showed no interest. These bones were picked clean. Their new feast lay back inside the cavern. They swarmed back in that direction. He held the flashlight out in front of him and pushed on into the mountain against the squealing tide. He lost his sense of direction. He hoped he was going roughly west, but he couldn't tell. The roof came down to a couple of feet. He was crawling through an old geological seam, excavated long ago for its ore. The roof came down even more, down to 1.5 feet. It was cold. The seam narrowed. His arms were out in front of him. The seam became too narrow to pull them back. He was crawling down a slim rock tube, 1,000,000,000 tons of mountain above him, no idea where he was going, and the flashlight was failing. The battery was spent. Its light was fading to a dull orange glow. He was breathing hard and shaking, not from exertion, from dread, from terror. This was not what he had expected. He had visualized a stroll down a spacious abandoned gallery. Now this narrow crack in the rock. Not this narrow crack in the rock. He was pushing himself headfirst into his worst childhood nightmare. He was a guy who had survived most things, and he was a guy who was rarely afraid. But he had known since his early boyhood that he was terrified of being trapped in the dark, in a space too small to turn his giant frame. All his damp childhood nightmares had been about being closed in tight spaces. He lay on his stomach and screwed his eyes shut. Lay and panted and gagged, forced the air in and out through his clamping throat. Then he inched himself slowly onward into the nightmare. The glow from the flashlight finally died 100 yards into the tunnel. The darkness was total. The seam was narrowing. It was pushing his shoulders down. He was forcing himself into a space that was way too small for him. His face was forced sideways. He fought to stay calm. He remembered what he had said to Borkin. People were smaller then, scrappy little guys, migrating west, seeking their fortune in the bowels of the mountain. People half the size of Reacher, squirming along, maybe on their backs, chipping the bright veins out of the rock roof. He was using the dead flashlight like a blind man uses a white cane. It smashed on solid rock 2 feet ahead of his face. He heard the tinkle of glass over the rasping of his breath. He struggled ahead and felt with his hands. A solid wall. The tunnel went no further. He tried to move backwards. He couldn't move at all. To push himself backwards with his hands, he had to raise his chest to get leverage, but the roof was too low to let him do that. His shoulders were jammed up hard against it. He could get no leverage. His feet could push him forward, but they couldn't pull him backwards. He went rigid with panic. His throat clamped solid, his head hit the roof, and his cheek hit the grit floor. He fought a scream by breathing fast. He had to go back. He hooked his toes into the grit, turned his hands inward, and planted his thumbs on the floor, pulled with his toes and pushed with his thumbs. He moved backward a fraction, and then the rock clamped hard against his sides. To slide his weight backwards, his shoulder muscles were bunching and jamming against the rocks. He breathed out and let his arms go limp, pulled with his toes. They scrabbled uselessly in the grit. He helped them with his thumbs. His shoulders bunched and jammed again. He jerked his hip from side to side. He had a couple of inches to spare. He smashed his hands into the shale and heaved backwards. His body jammed solid, like a wedge in a door. He tilted sideways and banged his cheek on the roof, jerked back down and caught his other cheek on the floor. The rock was crushing in on his ribs. This time, he couldn't fight the scream. He had to let it go. He opened his mouth and wailed in terror. The air in his lungs crushed his chest against the floor and his back against the roof. He couldn't tell if his eyes were open or shut. He pushed forward with his feet and regained the inch he moved back. He stretched with his arms, fell up again. His shoulders were jammed so tight he couldn't move his hands through much of an angle. He spread his fingers and scrabbled them left and right, up and down. Solid rock ahead. No way to go forward. No way to move backward. He was going to die, trapped inside the mountain. He knew it. The rats knew it. They were sniffing up behind him, coming closer. He felt them at his feet. He kicked out and sent them squealing away, but they came back. He felt their weight on his legs. They were swarming over him. They burrowed up around his shoulders, slid under his armpits. He felt cold, oily fur on his face as they forced their way past, the flick of their tails as they ran ahead. To where? He let them run over his arms to estimate the direction. They were moving ahead of him into the blind darkness. He felt with his hands, felt them flowing left. Their passage was stirring the air. The air was cool. He felt it move, a faint breeze, on the sweat on the left side of his face. He jammed himself hard against the right-hand wall and moved his left arm sideways ahead of him. Felt for the left-hand wall. It wasn't there. He was stuck at a junction in the tunnel. A new seam ran at a right angle away from the end of the seam he was in. A tight, narrow right angle, 90 degrees. He forced himself backwards as far as his thumbs would push him. He scraped his face on the end wall and jammed his side into the rock, folded himself, arms first around the corner, and dragged his leg behind him. The new seam was no better. It was no wider. The roof was no higher. He hauled himself along, gasping and sweating and shaking. He propelled himself with his toes an inch at a time. The rats forced their way past him. The rock tore at his sides and his back, but there was still a slight breeze on his face. The tunnel was heading somewhere. He was gasping and panting. He crawled on. Then the new seam widened, still very low, a flat, low crack in the rock. He crawled on through it, exhausted. 50 yards, 100, then he felt the roof soar away above him. He pushed on with his toes, and suddenly he felt the air change, and he was lying halfway into the motor pool cavern. He realized his eyes were wide open, and the white Econoline van was right there in front of him in the dark. He rolled onto his back and lay gasping on the grit, gasping and shaking, staggered to his feet and looked back. The seam was invisible, hidden in the shadow. He made it as far as the white truck and collapsed again on his side. The luminous figures on his watch showed he'd been in the tunnels nearly 3 hours, most of the time jammed there sweating in a panic. A 3-hour screaming nightmare come to life. His pants and his jacket were shredded. Every muscle in his body was on fire. His face and his hands and his elbows and knees were bleeding. But it was the fear that had done it to him, the fear of not getting through. He could still feel the rock pressing down on his back and pressing up on his chest. He could feel it clamping inward on his ribs. He got up again and limped to the doors, pushed them open, and stood in the moonlight, arms out, eyes crazy, mouth open, breathing in lungfuls of the sweet night air.